who published short story collections last year. So we have John Bengan, who wrote Armor, published by Ateneo de Manila University Press. And then Elizabeth Joy Serrano-Quijano, who wrote Dili Pwede Mogawas, Upang Mga Sugilanon, or Can't Go Out and Other Stories, also published by Ateneo de Davao University Publication Office. And we have Jade Mark Capiñanes, who wrote How to Grieve, published by Everything's Fine PH. The panel will be moderated by Jhoanna Lynn, Cruz, author of the memoir Abinako, or So I Thought, published by UP Press, and the editor of Kingle, Anthology of Pinay Lesbian Writing, published by Angel Publishing. So without further ado, here is Miss Jhoanna.
Thank you, Kobe. Thank you everyone for coming today. I know that our panel was scheduled at 11 a.m., but we were postponed to this hour because there was a mass at the same time. And of course, we don't want to compete with God. Not at all. So we might be struck down by lightning. So thank you for staying, and thank you for going your lunch break to listen to our panel on Mindanao writing. I'm Jhoanna Cruz. I'm the president of the Davao Writers Guild, and I also teach at the University of the Philippines, Mindanao. So please welcome today. We have three authors, authors of collections of short stories that were published last year. No? So that means they're all competing for the National Book Award if their publishers submit their books to the awards. But they're not fighting naman. Ano? And we will see from our panel today that these are very different books. No? They're really in their own categories, if you ask me. And it is my pride and joy to moderate this discussion today. So thank you very much for being here. So while we're waiting for Joy, I know that she's here. Joy Serrano-Quijano is actually from Mindanao, Davao del Sur. So she did travel with her family all the way just to join us today for our panel. And we hope that she will be here presently. But I know that she's here somewhere in the mall. So, but yeah, no, so we have to begin our panel. So I'd like to start with, or by asking our featured authors about their books. No? So what are these books about? So John.
Hi. Thank you, Jo. My book is called Armor. It's a collection of stories, and it's all set in Davao City. So usually the stories are most of them are about characters who are caught in situations. Mostly they are people in trouble. And these are based on my own experience of growing up in Davao City in the 90s and the late 2000s. So the reader who is from Davao will find a lot of things that are familiar, especially if they were around at that time. So and I'm also queer, so many of the characters here are queer. Or are trying to navigate the queer experience, what it's like to be a bayot here in Davao City, if I may use the word. And in the backdrop is the strange kind of environment of being one of the most progressive and relatively peaceful city in Mindanao, which we know have a lot of have gone through a lot of things in those decades, but at the same time there's violence going on everywhere. So that's part of what the book was. It was after writing the book, I realized that it was me trying to also look back on that experience of getting to know Davao as a that is full of contradictions like that. So yeah, that's my book part.
That's fascinating, John. And also quite educational for me because I moved to Davao in 2007. So the subject of your book is Davao City in the late 90s, early 2000s. And would you say that it was really like a different time, like compared to today's Davao City?
Well, slightly different in the sense that we just kind of kept to ourselves. I mean, what happened in the last 6 years would catapult Davao into like the national psyches, national consciousness. So maybe that's different. Back then, we just have our own kind of awareness of what's happening here. Sometimes the national press would pay attention, but not really as you know. So different, but not quite. Less traffic back then. Less traffic, less dusty back then. But some of the characters are affected by some of the major events that happened, like the summary killings that took place almost every day in the late 90s and 2000, and the bombings of the ports. So I was in high school at that time and college, so I guess, yeah, those events have turned into something else now. So I'm not sure if it's different because there was also a bombing in 2016. So same but not quite.
Yeah, like they say, same but different. Okay, thank you. How about you, Jade? What's your book about?
Hello. So good afternoon, guys. Good afternoon. My book is How to Grieve. It is a collection of short stories, but they're mostly flash fiction. So some of the pages will just run for a few pages. In terms of theme, of course, like the title itself is about grieving. And at first glance, you will get the idea that it's about how to grieve. It's like an instructional or a manual about how to grieve. But when you read the pieces here, well, the pieces are titled after how to do something, so how to do this, how to do that. But if you read the stories, it's more really about not teaching you how to grieve, but how to experience, the experience of grieving, and tama ba talaga na may pattern or may rule or may format na dapat i-follow if mag-grieve tayo, something like that. So, this is my take on yung popular ngayon na motivational mga stories, and it draws in from hugot culture, but I'm trying to make it different. So, yeah.
We'll discuss that in greater detail later. But would you say that, because I saw your post yesterday on the first day of the book fair, where you said that your book is coming home. So in what way is this book a Davao book?
Well, first and foremost, daughter, I live in Davao. But later, I think we will discuss this about the place. But this is a Davao book because I wrote a lot of the stories when I was here. So the experience of being in Davao, my consciousness during that time was really shaped by my own experiences when I was in Davao. So later on, I think I can elaborate more on that.
But actually, you can talk about it now while we're waiting for Joy.
So
since you're already in that note about in what way is this book coming home to Davao? Yeah, because yung question ko sa'yo is, when I read your book, I felt that the stories were not set in a very specific place. So only the last story mentions that the narrator is in Davao City. So that's why I wanted you to talk more about in what way is this a Davao City book?
So I think it has a lot to do with the theme of the book, and that is grief and grieving. And for me, kasi grief puts us in a place of placelessness. So for me, what matters more in the book is not really geographical location, or geographical completeness, but more on emotional landscape that the characters in the stories are trapped in some sort. So instead of looking at Davao as this geographical area na medyo expansive and more into hyper-specificity na yung characters natin are in these very narrow places like Jollibee or at a Bulalo place. Ganun. So I think it has a lot to do with the theme of the book.
Yeah, no, so actually of this line from Rebecca Solnit, where she says, every love has its landscape. So, in what way is this a landscape of your life? Yan na agad, di ba?
Well, okay, ano naman siya, it's mostly autobiographical. Okay, so I wrote these stories during and after a breakup, so it's, it was me trying to make sense of the emotional place I was in at that time. So I hope that reflects in the stories. Yeah.
Nag-warm up pa siya. Pero kung pinapollow niyo siya sa Facebook, alam niyo na kung ano yung mga sinasabi niya na paano ba makabangon niyo after breakup. Kasi sabi nga niya, yung libro ay parte din ng hugot culture na that we are all familiar with. Alright, sige. So, yung pangalan natin, ang title ay Mindanao Fictions. So, naisip ko yun dahil maraming mga fiction, ang mga tao tungkol sa Mindanao. So I'd like us to address that briefly. What are these Mindanao fictions that you strive to address in your book? Or do you even try to? Is that something that you are concerned with engaging with or not? Yeah, John?
When I was writing these stories, I was very conscious that I'm going to set them in Davao City. So when you set a particular place in fiction, of course, it's literally not Davao City because it's fictive, it's imagined, but at the same time, it's informed by the place, my experience of the place. So the first three stories here, I was still trying to somehow reconcile how I see Davao City, how I am adopting to it because I wasn't born here. I moved here very young, but I wasn't born here. So it was me trying to get a deeper sense of the place. And then the latter stories, because it took me 18 years to finish this book, the latter stories, I had a more conscious approach to what it means to write about Mindanao. So, I'm aware that conflicts do not happen in isolation, they're connected, and that the long history of Mindanao, its development, its growth, its struggles, its continuing struggles until today inform events, whether or not they are depicted in non-fiction or fiction, in art or in real life, as they happen in real life. So I take that consciousness when I write, even just a story about kids who are rapping about, for example, I have a story here about kids who are rapping about the killings. So I do not, of course, put everything because it would crowd the story, but the decisions, the possibilities, I try to consider what kind of behavior, what kind of decision would a character have if they are exposed to this kind of realities. So in a sense, yes. But of course, as I grew older, I was able to read more works by Mindanao writers like Makshu, the stories of people more canonical like Grieve and so having been exposed to their works also helped me not align but rather communicate with their works as well. I mean, not my story was to communicate with the chief Warner, the love in the corners.
I'd like to interrupt you. That's interesting. In what ways do you do that? So in a way, you really aren't conscious of the fact that you're not writing in a vacuum. No? So you are a Mindanao writer, and so you, as you said, you communicate with other fictions written about or in or for Mindanao. So could you give us a specific example of that communication or interaction?
There is so few of them, but now few of them are accessible. But because of recent anthologies, they are now coming to the fore. But when I find, for example, someone like Anthony Tan who writes about Siasi Sulu, he doesn't have a book of fiction, but he has a short story called, oh my god, I'm forgetting the title. But he has a short story about, it's a wonderful story. It's a short story set in a book in Sulu, and it's about this man who is trying to decide whether or not he's going to, if somebody is killing them one by one in the book. And in the concept of vengeance and Taoism culture and Sama culture is like the theme that runs in that story. And I feel like when I read that story, it makes me, and when I write about violence in my work, it kind of behooves me to respond to Tony Tan's, the way he conceptualized and the way he depicts the mindset of the character in that situation. So yes, and I guess with either Rivera for the stories about little girls. Okay, I have one story here that is about a little girl whose father is a rebel returnee, and I cannot help but think of the young girls in the Rivera for stories. And Mac chose short stories about those who went underground, those who are or who were engaged in rebellion. And some of my stories also touch on that subject. So yeah, it informs ano na yung nagawa ni na Sir Mac I try to continue the conversation, what it means now in my time. Does it make sense?
Yeah, actually, and I guess, so I like the word that you use, that you're continuing a tradition of writing in Mindanao. And it's not like if you're a story writer, you feel compelled to say something new. Is that something that concerns you?
I guess new in the sense that if they have done it before, you don't repeat what they have already accomplished, so you try to do something else. But the fact that you're writing about your time, there are things about your time that they, I'm speaking as if their time is over now. But I mean, your time as you were, in your early adulthood, stage in life. So, but at the same time, there's also that, as I'm writing in English, that there's a short story tradition in English, and I'm also aware of that, but that's a bigger, that's kind of a bigger thing that I sometimes don't concern myself, but at the back of my head is there. Like the short story form, and stuff like that. So.
Yeah. The anxiety of influence, sabi ni Tia Serrano. Okay, before Jade answers, please welcome Elizabeth Joy Serrano-Quijano, all the way from Mindanao, Jollibee. Okay. So the first question is really just tell us about your book. What is your book about?
So, Dili Pwede Mogawas is a collection of short stories, all set in Mindanao, Davao del Sur. So, the stories include, of course, women, mothers, children, and indigenous people of Davao del Sur.
So you're a Blaan writer,
Yes, ma'am.
but also Ibaloy. Yes. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
My mom was migrated to Magsaysay, Davao del Sur in the late 1950s. Then they started farming because they were newlyweds, my grandparents, so they want to start anew in Davao del Sur. So, their new life, so they started a family in Magsaysay, Davao del Sur. So, Magsaysay and Mindanao are just neighboring towns in Davao del Sur. So, that's why they are here. They were here in Davao del Sur. There are also a little cultural community of Ibaloys in Magsaysay. So, they were parang migrants, but our settlers, no? In that place, in Magsaysay. So, yun. So, nakilala niya yung father ko na isa rin Blaan. So, very diverse yung roots. Blaan, Ibaloy. So, my mother is a pure Ibaloy actually. Pero since I grew up in a Blaan community, so that's why I claim to be a Blaan. But hindi ako masyadong na-expose or even hindi kami tinuruan ni mama na magsalita ng Ibaloy or ng language nila. So, yun yung isa rin sa regrets ko. So, I'm a Blaan Ibaloy na meron din Kapampangan because my lolo also sa father's side is a Kapampangan from Bacolor in Pampanga. So, nag-migrate din dito. So, parang joke ko na, parang most naman sa blood ko is from Luzon. Ibaloy at Kapampangan are 25% lang yung Blaan. Pero sabi nila, hindi naman daw nagpa-percentage ang blood. So, hindi mo nagsabi ko, 25% Blaan. Hindi mo naman na-measure ang blood. So, it's parang, ano yung talagang kinalakan mo, paano yung i-claim mo, paano yung culture mo. So, yun yung, so that's why, parang ako confused. Blaan ko na Blaan or Blaan. Pero since I grew up and embraced in the cultural community of the Blaan, so I claim to be a Blaan. Hindi naman daw sinasabi pure or half or 25%. So parang mas na since nag-grow up na ako sa Blaan community, kaya pinag-claim ko na Blaan ako. So hindi ko kinakalimutan yung pagka-Ibaloy ko. Pero I am really proud of Blaan because wala kasi representation, ma'am. So when I grew up also sa public school, we read how my brother Lynn, mga places in Luzon. So mostly they are written in Luzon, the writers are from Luzon. So I wondered at my young age, bakit walang Davao? Bakit walang Mindanao na nakaset? So it takes me a lot of years to write those stories, parang experiences, pakikisalamuha sa mga tao, and pakikinig sa mga kwento ng iba. So, yun. So, I came up with these 10 stories from my grandmothers, from the people that I have yung nakasalamuha, and then, yun, mga narinig ko lang din na parang pinagpagpitapit yung mga scenes. So, yun yung pagkakasulat ko sa mga kwento ng librong ito na Dili Pwede Mogawas.
You mentioned in one of your Facebook posts, stalker ako. You're the first published female Blaan writer. Really? Parang kasi wala na representation ng Blaan. So na-mention meron si Ibrahim Jubayo. Ausog ba siya? So, sino ba yung meron pang mga IT, Calvi, Asaio na from Sulu also. Pero ako, ngayon lang ako nakakita ng Blaan book. So this book of yours is really, I think, concerned with Blaan representation. So, what primary fiction about the Blaans as a people would you say influenced the spirit of this book?
The Blaan people, I am representing the Blaan of Davao del Sur. Although meron din sa South Cotabato, sa Sultan Kudarat, sa Davao Occidental. Pero meron sinasabi natin, meron din nakapag-distinguish, meron siyang distinctness ang Blaan ng Davao del Sur kasi may pagkakaiba siya from the South Cotabato Blaan na sa in terms of language, culture. So I want to represent the Blaan of Davao del Sur because yun na nga sinasabi ko na wala pa akong nabasa ng mga sinusulat
I think that's noble of you, no? Pero ang bigat ng burden kung ikaw lang mag-isa. So, syempre, sana one of the things that we want the book to do, of course, is to encourage more writing from, not just from the Blaan peoples, but the other indigenous peoples in Mindanao. Okay. So, balik tayo kay Jade. Yan. Ano yung Mindanao Fictions that do you engage with in this particular book? Because of course you have other collections of short stories. So this is not your first book, as you know. So, but in this book, is there something in particular about the Mindanao Fictions that you are engaging with?
Siguro if I, it's, because for me, identity is in itself a fiction. Identity is fiction. I don't think identity as a monolithic absolute thing. So if we say Mindanao identity is not just this one thing. So maybe that's the fiction that I'm trying to deal with in this first story collection. Yun lang kasi, compared to Sir John and Ma'am Joy's work, na very conscious and concerned and very complete yung depictions ng reality in Mindanao. I think yung pagiging Mindanao ng book ko appears in more subtle ways. For example, kasi personally, yung father side ko came from Iloilo. Yung mama ko naman, native sa Davao, my mother has Tagan and Mandaya blood. So yung mama ko and yung father ko is from Iloilo. Ako naman, I grew up in a Tausug community. Yes, in Panakan. So, since I was a child, I really didn't have, a solid grasp of, or an absolute idea of what Mindanaoan identity is. So, I think that diversity or hybridity shows in the stories in terms of the forms. Because if you read the story, diverse yung mga forms ng story, iba-iba yung styles, and hybrid din in a sense because some stories may read like fiction and at the same time an essay. May mga stories na parang tula. So, ganun. So, compared to Sir John and Ma'am Joy, na yung Mindanao identity nila shows in the content, I'd like to think that my Mindanao identity shows in the form. And the form, of course, is a product of the subconscious natin na, for example, sa language mo, sabi nga ng editor and publisher ko na sa Katrina, my English daw is very different from the English, for example, mga writers sa Manila. So I think that language, that structure of seeing reality, and the way I see reality itself was really shaped by my own experiences here, living in Mindanao. So kahit hindi obvious, I'd like to think na very influenced yung consciousness of living in Mindanao.
Yung kasi one of the fictions, I guess, about Mindanao writing is that we should always write about local color, no? In quotation marks. So is that something that you're like actively subverting in your book?
Hindi rin kasi when I was writing, I wrote most of the stories, say 5 years ago. So, bata pa ako na 5 years ago. So, at that time, I was just concerned about writing what I was experiencing, I was feeling. So, in terms of local color naman, kasi again, I always feel that pressure, di ba? If you're a writer, okay, you have to write your place. Dapat ganito, dapat makita yan sa sa stories mo. But for me, it will really show ako. Yung mga ganun. And I think naman, Jollibee is local color. Diba? Ulalo, diba? All those things. So, what I'm trying to say is that hindi masyado akong conscious na if I write, I really have to write about Korean. Like, I really have to write about a specific cultural thing here in Mindanao. What I was trying to write is what I feel at that moment, and I really think that you're being Mindanao, you're being Davao, you really show up in one way or another, in more subtle ways.
And of course, it's the job of the critic to surface it, no? So, we just, yung ngayon, explain ko lang din para sa audience na what a treat it is really for us to hear the subconscious and the conscious thoughts, no, of our authors. Because normally, pag nagsusulat, hindi namin iniisip, no, yung itong mga bagay na to na is this story a Mindanao story, no? Pero dahil may mga panel na ganito, opportunity na ganito, napapag-isip din kami, no, na ano ba yung role namin as understands these fictions or in actively subverting them. So this is a very strange activity actually for us. And what an opportunity for us to hear these thoughts. But the better opportunity, of course, is to hear the authors read their own work. Yan. So, nandito na tayo sa exciting na part. Yan. So, Jade, since ikaw na yung last, would you like to, ang sabi ko lang, read your favorite bits in your book, short excerpt, no? That would represent maybe a favorite from your book.
Hello again. So this excerpt comes from the story How to Start a Farm. So the story is most likely yung thoughts of a narrator na gustong tumira sa bukid. Kasi diba, if you live in Davao, it's very stressful here. If you commute pa talaga everyday, nasa stuck sa traffic. So you end up thinking about